Welcome back to the Urban Monk. Dr. Pedram Shojai here to talk about risk and getting it right. There's been so much noise in the media, about the media, in the last couple weeks since the election. It's been this kind of ongoing trending thing about who the heck we could even trust, right? There are news agencies on all sides of the fence. Everyone's kind of firing across and saying, well, that's not a legitimate source, and what is a legitimate source? We booked this interview before this because we're talking about this in the kind of context of health and health research, but now it's just kind of out here in front of us to speak about kind of all of it and really talking about what a credible source would be, where to put our attention, where to maybe not put so much attention and pay less attention to the yellow journalism or whatever we want to call it nowadays. So with me today is Jeffrey Cabot, who wrote a book called Getting Risk Right. He is a researcher that's been working as a cancer epidemiologist and is here to really help us understand how one can look at these studies, which studies are worth looking at, and what to maybe not pay attention to. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Pedram. Great to be here.
Yeah, great. Thanks for doing this work because it's such a confusing time. It really is. The health industry, of which I'm part, and I'm kind of a known, I'm very political about this, is that, there's this kind of phenomenon we call clickbait. And so you have these business marketers that come into the health space and talk about claims and make claims and say sensational things because they drum up fear, and there's nothing better than fear to get money out of people's pockets. And so it's a terrible part of this kind of health cabal, it is getting people to not be able to trust credible sources either. And so I would really love to kind of find some sanity in this and start looking at maybe better ways to kind of set up filters for our information. So how did you, I'll start this by just asking how you got into this type of research.
Well, the way it happened is that I'm an epidemiologist, so I study all sorts of, one of the nice things about epidemiology is you can apply the method, which is gathering information and looking at statistical associations, and you can apply that to all sorts of, almost any different behavior or exposure or event that affects health. And so that's very nice. So I started out doing studies on smoking and alcohol consumption and their effects on cancers of the mouth and the lung and the bladder and so on, and I moved into studies on diet and moved into studies on hormones, both exogenous hormones, hormone replacement, oral contraceptives, and hormone levels measured in blood, and what do they have a meaningful relationship to the development of, say, leukemia or to brain cancer or to whatever. So those are and we did studies of electromagnetic fields, which was a big to-do back in the 80s and the 90s, huge scare. And also, we did studies on pesticide levels in blood. So while doing this work and publishing these studies, and it takes enormous work to analyze your data well, put it in the context of what else has been published, and get it published in a good journal, and huge amount of work. And while I was engaged in this 10 or 15 years into my career, I noticed that the public is getting these other messages, and the public is talk about clickbait. The public is running with all sorts of messages that we state in our papers and our reviews and so forth are highly questionable. So there was this disjunction, and partly because of my background, I actually found what I call the sociology of health risks and the psychology of health risks. I found it totally fascinating. So I began I wrote a book that came out in 2008 called Hyping Health Risks. And so that entailed a huge amount of work. And I focused on four different major to-dos, like radon in the houses, like pesticides and breast cancer, and two others. And wrote these detailed case studies and tried to explain what we actually know and contrast that with the extreme scaremongering that had people calling our hotline. Like, I was at Stony Brook at the time, and we'd get calls from terrified parents about the electric power lines running outside their child's window. And they wanted to know, should they move? Should they sell their house? Or should they buy a house that was near a power line? Questions like that. And people really, really suffer from these things. And so I was in a position to say, hey, look, if you look at all of the data on this question, here's what you can conclude. And that's very, very different. I mean, an extreme contrast with what you're hearing and what people are writing books about and articles in the New Yorker about in the 80s about power lines. So that's where it came from.
So how much? I'm very curious about this because I hear a lot of the hype. My sensitivity to it would say I don't want a power line by my head. But when I looked at some of the studies, the risk drops off a cliff as you start moving further and further away, and like 50 feet away is almost negligible. And so you looked at this. How many studies did you look at? What's the answer?
Okay, this has been studied. Electromagnetic fields have been studied for over 30 years. And I'm glad you put consideration number one at the top of the list, and that is that the strength of the field falls off as the square of the distance from it. So, if you grind your coffee with an electric coffee grinder, if you use an old electric blanket manufactured before 1980, you could get significant electric blanket. You're sleeping under it all night, cycles on. You could get significant exposure. Okay, those are the extremes. Ambient exposure, normal exposure to these fields is very, very low, and in fact, there's from epidemiologic studies in humans and from animal studies and from studies of workers who are exposed, have heavier exposure, like telephone linemen, there is no compelling evidence that we should be worrying about these fields, okay, at all.
Interesting.
And so we can go on to worry about other things. And the huge studies have been done looking at childhood leukemia, which was the first disease that was thought to be caused by these fields. And the National Cancer Institute published a huge study, and there just wasn't any sign, any blip with hundreds and hundreds of measurements using Gauss meters in children's rooms and over a period of 24 hours, doing the best kind of study one could do. And there were multiple studies. We did a study of that ilk, and so we could really put that to rest. But one thing is, you can never totally discount that there might be some little effect there. But the fact is that the diseases that we're worried about, we have to be looking elsewhere for causes and not we've done that justice.
Interesting. Okay, what about Bluetooth by the brain? There's these, now everyone's wearing these kind of Bluetooth headsets that are right next to their brain, so you don't have as much distance from the EMF. Did you guys look at that?
Okay, I should preface it by saying I'm not a biophysicist or an electrical electronics engineer, so I don't know exactly what that's putting out. What I can tell you is that as an epidemiologist, I've been, and one of the chapters in the book is about cell phones. So, and cell phones have been widely studied. I don't know what there is by way of their measurements, but I don't know what there is by way of long-term studies of populations using Bluetooth. And when a technology is new, it takes time to amass data on the question, years. So, um, so what I can tell you is, again, what this goes for electromagnetic fields, and it goes for radio frequency radiation, which I don't like to call it radiation, because the minute you say radiation, it scares the hell out of people. Mm-hmm. You really call it radio frequency energy emitted from the cell phone headset and from base stations. And again, after now 20 years of study of this question, there is no, and animal experiments, which are important because you can really expose animals to the frequency that you want, that's similar to what we're exposed to, and you can expose them to, for longer periods of time to get a real solid exposure and see what happens. So there have been good studies done. That's my emphasis. There's a lot of studies that you should ignore them. They're just crude and don't really get at what you're trying to get at. And those studies, again, don't really show anything. So again, we're no closer to knowing about what's causing brain cancer, for example, which is the primary concern there, and those are various types, and acoustic neuroma and so forth. But it's really reassuring to know that people speak of we're doing an experiment on the human population, which is true in a sense. In 1980, there were virtually no cell phones, certainly not digital, or the later generations. Now there are 6 billion cell phone subscriptions. That doesn't mean individuals worldwide. In the United States, 90% of the population has, or a very high percentage, has cell phones. So we've gone from 0 to almost total saturation, people using cell phones. And so let's look at what has happened to rates of brain cancer, where we have very good reporting in Scandinavia and Australia and European countries and the United States. We can track the rates of brain cancer, all brain cancer or different types of brain cancer, and they haven't increased. And you would expect them to increase, particularly in younger age groups, and after a certain period of time, you'd expect them to go up, and they're not going up. So again, I would never say that there couldn't be any risk associated with using these things, and if one wants to use hands-free, if one wants to minimize the risk, I don't see that. I'm all for it, but one doesn't really need to, given everything we know, and there are multiple sources of, on theoretical grounds, it's also highly improbable, because this energy is too weak to mess up the molecules that are jiggling around in our body. It's 10,000 times below the threshold of of the molecular energy. So it's hard to see how it could have any impact on our cells. So if you put all of that together, we can probably go on. Of course,
We could chill out.
there are more and better studies going on, but we can probably move on to other things. Watch out for the bus when you're crossing the street, and other serious
Sure.
things.
Yeah, or don't text while driving. It'll probably save your life way more than that.
Well, that's it.
Yep.
That's it. I mean,
Yep.
there's some studies show that there's a fourfold increased risk, and there's a surge this past year or 2015 in traffic accidents that are that are attributed to distracted driving. So whether your hands are free or not, you get distracted.
Yeah.
I'm not good at doing two things at once,
Sure.
and people aren't good at.
I would argue that nobody is. Nobody is. If you're not, then most people would follow suit. Quick question. It's kind of a devil's advocate question, but did anyone look at? Okay, so we're looking at cancer epidemiology. Okay, flatline or no big delta. It's the same. We don't really see any big blip over there. What about like erratic behavior, anxiety, depression, anything that would be more of like a behavioral thing? Was that looked at with any of this subtle electric activity?
There are studies, and there's a lot of interest, I should mention, in Wi-Fi in schools, and a lot of parents are very worried about Wi-Fi in schools. Again, I think the basic principle applies that people have done measurements of these fields, and they're very, very low. So actually, you reminded me, there is a literature on I don't remember if it's ADHD, if it's other emotional disturbances, and people have done very good studies of that. And it turns out that they can do sham exposures, they can do other exposures that actually elicit an effect, but the Wi-Fi exposure does not elicit an effect. But these are tricky psychological experiments because people can there's an effect where you can psychologically prime yourself. So these are tricky studies to do. But again, it appears that the fields are so weak that they're not messing with your. Now, then people posit, and they do this in letters to me and say, stupid, you didn't consider that. Then people posit, well, what if there's a cascade effect where you're exposed to air pollution and the electromagnetic fields are helping the air pollution to aggregate, and you're breathing that in or something. Maybe that's what's causing brain tumors or something. And you can always, but of course you can spin off hundreds of different possibilities, and if they make sense logically, then they are worth looking at. But you have to keep things. You have to use Occam's razor. You have to keep things simple and first look at the big things. And if one does good studies and shows that, look, there's no main effect, there's no after 20, 30 studies and studies of different kinds, then that's telling us something. And of course, there are always going to be things, interactions or mixtures or weird situations that we didn't consider. What we can say is, across the board, we can't find much that's going on.
That's very interesting, and it's very good to know. It reminds me of this one kind of standout piece in a book called The Emperor of All Maladies, which is speaking of cancer epidemiology, where everyone. So this guy was so brash with this assumption that maybe potentially lung cancer was caused by smoking, and. I remember the quote, and this isn't the exact quote, but the gentleman who retorted said, it's just as likely that this lung cancer comes from nylon stockings, because the rise in the use of nylon stockings was, kind of synonymous with all
the
this.
The correlation in the 50s. That's right.
Yeah.
I got to tell you, Pedram, that I started out working for Ernst Winder, who was in the United States, the person who did the first study. He did it in St. Louis with a lung cancer surgeon, and showed that smokers had tenfold increased risk of developing lung cancer. So that's how I started out
Wow.
with someone who knew, and he took a lot of flack, and people said, people didn't want to believe it, even though surgeons like Michael DeBakey in the 30s, they had observed, just by looking at smokers' lungs, they had were great believers in that, but you had to do the study. And then, of course, hundreds of studies were done, and different, more and more powerful studies, prospective studies rather than case control studies, and they all confirmed the same things. So I think that's what you're referring to in The Emperor of All Maladies.
Yeah, it was fascinating because it was so pervasive that so many people smoked that it wasn't this thing that was able to just be kind of called out in a lineup. And it took a while. So that kind of points to a big piece in your book that you're also talking about, which is the commercial interests that oftentimes have a dog in this race. And so, Marlboro and Camel and Winston, those guys had no interest in having that data be true. And so how much of that do we see as we start to unpack these studies and, especially the ones that we should be hearing about?
Well, it's very complicated because commercial interests and industry is extremely powerful. But what I would say is that the smoking and lung cancer story is sort of a tremendously powerful story, but it's not a guidebook to every issue that comes up. A lot of things are more complicated, and I'm trying to think of a good example. But for example, there's so much interest in diet, and people have been studying diet and cancer for 30, 40 years, and I think we know that diet plays a role diet and body weight play an important role in diabetes and in cardiovascular disease. And we know that body weight, obesity affects your risk for certain cancers, particularly cancer of the endometrium, the uterus, but also for postmenopausal breast cancer. And then we know that alcohol increases the risk for certain cancers, mouth, throat, larynx, particularly in combination with smoking. Beyond that, there's all this study of fiber. Does fiber decrease the risk for colon cancer? Does vitamin E or selenium supplements are taken in the diet, do they decrease the risk for prostate cancer and other cancers? Does beta carotene decrease the risk for lung cancer? And these things have been studied over decades now, and the results have been disappointing. We haven't come up with much. So that's where now. That may be, and this is always a possibility, that may be because we're not looking in the right place, by which I mean that maybe it's diet in childhood or diet in adolescence that's decisive and may influence your future risk of developing these cancers. Because there's a phenomenon of imprinting both in utero and in childhood that may exposure to hormones and so on that may set you up 20, 30 years later or 40 years later to develop certain cancers. But as you can imagine, and people are beginning to think about that and look at that, that's much harder to study. So the studies we have of diet are middle-aged men and women who were asked about their diet and then followed for 10, 20 years. And those are the results I referred to, where we only a couple of things seem to have panned out, but mostly not. So you have industry which is plugging, cholesterol free and this, that, and the other thing, and all this stuff about food labels and what's good for you. And that's a very, very confusing area. What I think, since I brought up diet, what I think we can say on diet is that eating a varied diet, eating lots of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and pulses like lentils and things like that, is seems to be good for overall health. And one shouldn't, I think one shouldn't get bogged down in, well, how do you prevent colon cancer or prostate cancer with diet? We don't know, and we may not know for quite a while. But one should focus on what's good for your overall health. You're
Sure.
you're not one organ. You're a system.
Sure. So we have the macronutrients and obviously kind of like the big food groups and fibers and all that. What about there's a lot of buzz around, say, GMOs, preservatives, artificial colors, the different sweeteners, and pretty much everything is getting lined up and saying this is obviously cancer causing. How much of that have you and your team looked at? How much of that is substantiated? How much of it is a question mark?
Well, things like artificial sweeteners, going back to saccharin in 1980, and which people that I worked with did the first studies on, and there have been many studies since then, and aspartame and so forth. And of course, there's huge amount of research about what kind of diet increases obesity. So that's a huge, huge area. There is very little indication that pesticides in our food, which are trace amounts of chemicals, and the big news of the big boy on the block is glyphosate at the moment. I mean, past people were concerned about DDT and atrazine and other pesticides, and it's understandable to be concerned about chemicals in the environment and chemicals in our food. But there, people need to understand that if something is, you're taking it in trace amounts, parts per billion or something like that, chances are, unless it's something highly toxic like polonium or methylmercury or other things that are highly, highly toxic, there are other things that you're exposed to in much greater amounts. Like you're exposed to things in food, hormones in food. People are concerned about BPA is a good example, okay, and was taken out of a lot of products and baby bottles. But BPA is a good example because that's been studied very, very carefully, the pharmacology, the epidemiology, and we metabolize it. Even infants metabolize it, and 99% of it is excreted in the urine. We're exposed to very low amounts to start with. And so people were concerned that it mimics estrogen. Well, people have done the studies, people at the FDA, and it's like 1/10,000th of the binding power to estrogen receptors in the body. So there, again, it was looked at, and that doesn't seem to be a worry, and it got a huge amount of attention. So you mentioned pesticides, you mentioned GMOs. GMOs is another one of these huge things, issues, and people have very, very strong feelings, and it's a huge issue in Europe and in the European Union. It's a huge issue here. We have propositions in California trying to, people want to label GMOs with the idea that you should be able to know whether you're consuming something. And I've I know people who their life is studying and trying to clarify the issues about GMOs. And there are, point number one, to boil it down to 2 points. Point number one is that GMO is sort of a misleading term. People use genetically engineered crops. And what you're doing, what genetic engineering allows you to do is to replace a gene that will produce an enzyme that's desired in the plant. And that is no different from the kind of breeding that's been going on for hundreds of years, only it's more precise. You can control the trait instead of getting a number of different traits by crossing different strains to try to achieve the mixture of traits that you want. Here because you can look at the molecule and say, well, we want to put glycine in here or something. It's just more precise. GMOs are highly, highly regulated by the government. I don't think people appreciate that. This is point number two. They're highly regulated, and they've been studied. They have been studied. I can't say more than any other topic in health, but that may be the case. Thousands of studies of GMOs. Not one study has shown that there is a threat to health, or that taking in GMO or genetically engineered foods is less healthy than taking in and eating non-GMO foods.
I think the conversation has kind of shifted now to saying that, it's the GMO foods that have been modified to be able to resist glyphosate, which is now really kind of the killer of the microbiome and all these kind of, downstream issues. And so, I've seen this conversation start to get more nuanced and shift over the last little bit.
As it should. Yeah. So there, there are always more things that are going to turn up. And, I am not, first of all, I'm not an agronomist or an agricultural or a biologist. So I'm just trying to make sense for myself and for other people of, hey, points 1 and 2. But furthermore, there's confusion, and this could be point number 3. There's confusion about whether glyphosate poses a cancer risk. Okay, and it just so happens over the weekend I wrote an article about glyphosate and cancer, because this is another beautiful example of a message that gets put out there. And here we're talking about by a regulatory agency, the part of the UN, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, known as IARC, in Lyon, France. And in March 2015, let me say that all sorts of agencies, including the European Food Safety Authority, which is extremely, extremely conservative, have reviewed all of the evidence on glyphosate and Roundup, a popular product that contains glyphosate, and they found that at the levels at which people are exposed, there is no evidence that it increases cancer risk. Okay.
What about bioaccumulation, especially in the fat cells, and all these other conversations about kind of long-term exposure that eventually, is the straw that breaks the camel's back? Because there's a lot of ways, there's a lot of nuanced things around this.
Absolutely. this is, look, I don't think there aren't long-term studies like that, and you're not feeding humans different doses and looking at fat accumulation and so forth. So that to me sounds like an open question. And all of these, what I think what you can say is that um, again, going for first what we call main effects rather than interactions, going for just a simple question, does it increase the risk of cancer? There we have animal studies, and we know what humans are exposed to. That's what we have. And my point there would be, let's go back and see what the studies actually show. And there we have this problem of an agency which is very activist, IARC, cherry picking studies, and they ignore this mouse study, they focus on a different study, and concocting a message that this is a probable carcinogen, which really means very, very little. But it does scare people, and it keeps the activists going. You're making a different point, and that's sort of my point. Mm-hmm. We need serious people to address serious questions and serious possibilities, and that's a totally different endeavor from this crying from the rooftops that this agency said, that very cynically, I think, I mean, it's really, I have strong feelings about this because I am close to people who've really looked carefully at the studies and where's the beef and what did the studies show. And you have to look at all the studies. If you monkey around by choosing the studies that seem to show something interesting, to me, you are indulging in something that's sets us back. Mm-hmm. It wastes resources. It gets people upset about the wrong things. So by all means, let's talk about a real problem. That's again a main effect. Obesity has been increasing. People say it's been increasing since in the past 3 decades. Actually, it's interesting. It's been increasing since the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. And when there's a recession, obesity tends to go down a bit. But it's correlated with increasing television watching. Television came in shortly after World War II, and increasing more and more use of cars, the growth of suburbia, and this incredible availability of food that we have, mm-hmm. which they didn't have in the past. Mm-hmm. And so obesity has, we know, a third of the country is obese and another third is overweight. And this is a worldwide problem because it's happening at different rates in most countries in the world. And as a result of that, we have a huge looming problem, increasing problem with diabetes, and with other diabetes has all of the complications that it entails. And so if we agree that aside from smoking, diabetes is just one of these huge societal problems. Smoking is now coming down, and then the question is what to do about it. And there are legitimate questions. Well, there's agribusiness. There's, like it or not, our food is produced by, what percentage of the U.S. population are farmers? I mean, maybe 1% or something. And we have these huge farms. They are run very efficiently to produce as much to increase the yields. And we have cheap food, but we're dependent on agriculture. So I think an interesting question, to talk about with people who think about these things is there an alternative to agribusiness, to use of pesticides, and is that even realistic? And what would that look like? But what I can tell you is that as long as we're locked into this reality, we go to the supermarket and we buy and we get the cost of food as a proportion of the budget has gone way down over the past 70 years, and we're all better off for that. But there's as long as we're locked into this, we can reassure ourselves that, as far as we know, the pesticides that are being used, like glyphosate, are the least toxic ones. You have to compare them to the other pesticides. And if you didn't use glyphosate, yield would go down by, depends on the model, but would go down by 20%, 10%, 20%, 40% or something. So everywhere you look, food becomes more expensive. Poor people can't afford to buy produce.
Sure.
So one of the things is that when people have a one issue focus, you can agitate, you can propagandize about this is going on and this is threatening us. But you always have to look at, well, what are the trade-offs and what are the benefits? What are the trade-offs?
Do we need a smoking gun? Do we need a smoking gun? I mean, maybe the answer is don't eat as much, but we're blaming our shampoo. There's a lot of where the blame is misdirected.
Definitely don't eat as much, and definitely exercise more. But those aren't going to help people to lose weight.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Right.
I mean, you can give all that advice till you're blue in the face. They won't. So, and I don't think. I think there's got to be something other than gastric bypass surgery for extreme obesity. We have to come up and there must be solutions to walkable neighborhoods, less use of the car, all sorts of things. And standing up, I'm the designated cook in our household, and so one of the things I do, I'm standing for an hour, and it's a form of relaxation, but also that's one of the few times that I'm standing during the day. And some people have stand-up desks, and
I'm a big advocate of stand-up desk. I'm a big advocate of the 25-minute Pomodoro method, where you get up and do something every half hour and just keep moving.
Yes.
It's just there's so many things going against us. So I want to kind of wrap my brain around your gestalt. We're running out of time, and so when we start looking at getting risk right, are we looking at kind of like the black swans? It's like, look, you can worry about the cell phone thing, which we don't see any correlation, but really if you text in your car, that's where you're going to die. If you worry about, the glyphosate versus the actual, quantity and the movement, then the diabetes is what's going to get you much more likely than this. Like, can you contextualize this in a way, like, so what should we be worrying about?
Well, okay. I guess there are 2 points, because the book is trying to make is that there are things. Another chapter is on endocrine disrupting chemicals, and one of those, the poster child for that became in like 2008 and after became BPA. So I tell, and people began to write about endocrine disrupting chemicals in 1990 or so, and it became a big thing in Europe, and it became a big thing in the U.S. sort of independently. They were aware of each other. Okay, so the idea was that we're letting runoff. There's pollution that gets into the waterways, that gets into fish, that gets into the food chain, and so forth. And these things may be having disastrous effects. Okay, there were crocodiles were feminized in Florida, and on and on and on, instances of this. Okay, so, but it had people worrying again about trace amounts of various chemicals in food, in water, and so forth. And what people realized after thousands of scientific papers were published on this, what people realized is that, hey, wait a minute, the hormones that we're interested in that are doing things in your body, you're getting orders of magnitude larger, hundreds of times larger, thousands of times larger similar compounds from, if you're a woman, from your ovaries, from diet, like phytoestrogens, if you're eating Brussels sprouts or broccoli or all these cruciferous and other vegetables, many, and leafy vegetables, spinach, you're getting much larger amounts. And people who are using certain medications, like if they're pregnant, that they were missing. They, again, don't look at the vanishingly small before you, without taking into account the Mack truck in the room. So that's one point. Another point, but people get wedded to the fear of these trace amounts of these chemicals, okay? And they don't want to be told. They don't want to be told, shift your attention, at least take into account this other consideration. But there's another point. The scientific research, that's what drives the news. Certain things that are newsworthy. So people keep producing these things, and the public keeps, media keeps picking them up, and we keep seeing them. So they get reinforced. But nothing has happened with endocrine disrupting chemicals as a class being linked to any effect. So in normal people, not people living next to a GM plant, nothing has turned up after 20 years, but we read the headlines and it triggers this fear. I want to contrast that with questions where scientists work on a real issue, on a big issue, by posing an interesting question like what causes cervical cancer, are viruses involved in cervical cancer, and working out of the limelight. It's not sexy. It doesn't attract, get newspaper headlines. And over 30 years of, following a hypothesis, modifying it, reinforcing confirming the findings, identifying real molecules or real agents that are in the pathway, that's what led, after 30 years, to the development of the first vaccine to protect against cervical cancer, against human papillomavirus, 2006. Now we have a vaccine, non-valent vaccine, which protects against 9 different strains, the major 9 subtypes of the virus that are carcinogenic. Only a minority, there are 170 different types of this virus, only a minority of them, but 12, can cause cancer. So my point is that to learn, biology is complicated, and our lives are filled, we're free agents, we're not test animals. So to really answer an important question takes serious work, and it builds. And people don't appreciate that enough. I feel. And so in the book, I try to give two examples where we've learned mind-boggling things that have the potential to save millions of lives. And so that's the contrast with these things that get our blood pressure up and that we worry about, but then it's not going to do us any good.
Yeah, it's like the Steve Covey's 7 Habits is, when you want to get the big rocks in the jar first, then the little ones can fit in afterwards, but you'll never get the big ones. And so there are so many black swans in our lives that we can't even account for. But we know what's killing people for the most part, and so you're saying let's lean into that. But the problem is you can't get a headline a day out of that, and so the health media is corrupt. It's got I know I'm in the industry. I see it all the time. It pains me to see how much bullshit is being propagated out there because people are fearful. They're fearful for their health. They're fearful. I mean, we saw it in the elections. It's just fear. It sells. And so I want to caution our viewers and listeners to really understand that this is something that is now becoming very apparent with the recent election and how there's these information wars, and it's hard to know who to trust. I have a few questions from our audience, so I'm going to kick over because we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that we honor our people. So Lorenzo, what do we got, buddy?
All right, let's see. Leslie first, he brought up BPA, so she asked, what about BSA? Isn't that repackaging BPA?
Is BSA repackaging BPA? What do we know about that?
Well, it's a related molecule. And I don't think it's been studied. The thing about BPA is that it's been used for like 50 years, and it lines the tin cans. We get baked beans and all these other foods in, and it was also in plastic to make plastic more durable. And so we have a long history with that. So when people get up in arms over false messages put out by scientists who want to draw attention to their work, and there are some doozies out there in the BPA area, you have the problem of replacing a known industrial product with something that's not known. So I think that we don't know what the story is with BSA until more studies are done on it. But BPA probably was fine and has stood us in good stead, has protected us from dying from botulism, which is again a much greater concern.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Next.
MK asks, so why do we have all these cancers, dementia, gluten sensitivities in what seems like only in recent times? Do we have more of these issues, or do we just have stronger and more accessible diagnostics?
So why the prevalence of so much more cancer? Is there something else that we need to look at, or is there just better tracking mechanisms? Are we detecting more cancer, or is there a rise in cancer globally in terms of different cancer diagnoses? What are we looking at here?
That's a very good question. The main reason, first of all, it depends what your starting point is. Okay, so cancer overall has been decreasing in the United States for a very simple reason. Been decreasing in the past 10 or 15 years at least, and the reason for that is that lung cancer is a major component, is a major cancer, and people have stopped. People have cut back on smoking, and so that's driving a decrease overall. When you take out smoking-related cancers, lung cancer being the main one, there's no increase in cancer. So overall, I think melanoma is increasing. We know something about the causes of melanoma, and that seems to be, sun exposure, particularly in the adolescent years, and and other. By and large, there may be some increases in things like multiple myeloma or other, but on the whole, cancer is not increasing. The other consideration is, as you have an aging population, it's important to remember cancer is a disease of aging. Disease of aging. As you get into your 70s, colon cancer rates go, hit this, they double, they triple, they become as you go up in decades. So that's the other consideration. When people were dying, when the average life expectancy was age 45, 150 years ago, you had much less cancer because predominantly cancer is a disease of the older population.
Sure, but I mean, you could have the counter argument that goes, if you go to some village in Kazakhstan, the colon cancer rates are on the floor, whereas in kind of America, standard American diet, they go up, and over time they increase. So I mean, there's different ways to look at that with life expectancy and kind of risk factors, but it gets really complicated.
Right, and we have a lot more. People say, well, what are the risk factors for colon cancer? Well, people point to red meat. So you have a small increase, and that's not something that's tremendously overwhelming. And exercise seems to protect against colon cancer, and this has been a finding, as it seems to protect against breast cancer. And so that's an encouraging thing. But we don't, for pancreatic cancer, brain cancer, leukemia, we don't know what the main causes are. And so there's a lot that we have to learn. It's very humbling. As I said, it's not like smoking and lung cancer, where you have one activity, smoking, that accounts for 90% of lung cancers. That's not the remaining cancers are, estrogen plays a role in breast cancer, but it doesn't. Obesity is a risk factor, but for some of these cancers, but it doesn't explain the whole thing. There are other things out there. Viruses play some role in some cancers, but there's a lot more. But it doesn't seem to be industrial exposures or contaminants in our food or artificial sweeteners or preservatives. It doesn't seem to, and people have taken a serious look at those things over time. And so it's tough. As I said, it may be early life exposures that set us up to develop cancer.
So this is a dangerous question I'm asking this late in the game, but the microbiome, there's been a lot of conversation about the microbiome, the milieu of the microbiome, creating a culture of proper genomic expression, enzymatic activity, defense against certain kind of pathogenic microbes, and what have you. Anything you guys have looked at, or just as a scientific community, that would point to the health of the microbiome being tied to longevity and kind of risk factors for cancer?
I think that we're definitely not an expert in this area. I'm intrigued by it. I know some people at my institution who are diving in to the microbiome, who've worked on HPV, for example, and scientists always want to, go where the action is, which makes sense. And I think we're at the very beginning. So I think here again, talk about hype. People put results out there. It's unbelievably variable in different individuals, and unbelievable diversity of micro organisms, of the trillion microbes in your gut. And so I think it's going to take some time to begin to get to put the big picture together. And there's a microbiome project funded by the NIH. So this is something that I think in the future we're going to learn. It's like discovering the life in the ocean and the thermal vents in the ocean. It's discovering a new world, but I think we're just at the very beginning.
Yeah. Well, we don't know what we don't know, but we know that there's a lot there. But I think it's safe to assume that people are making claims. In both, I mean, so, whether you're red team, blue team, health team, or, kind of denier team, there's a lot of people with opinions, and everyone kind of wants to reinforce and get entrenched in their camp. So it's like, how dare you vaccinate your children versus how dare you not? And so, it's this pervasive theme that is echoing in multiple layers of our culture right now. And so what I really appreciate about your measured words here is that, look, A, it's complicated, B, we're looking at it, but let's just, let's let the science speak for itself, and there's a lot of hype out there. The book is called Getting Risk Right by Jeffrey Cabot. I'm going to put it right here. Is the book out yet? When is it available?
It's actually it's available. The formal publication date is tomorrow, but it's out, and it's with all the major booksellers, and you can easily find it on the web. Yeah.
Great. I love it. So November 22nd, book will be available everywhere. Facebook Live, you're seeing it now, but you can pre-order it. I love this kind of conversation. I think it's time to deconstruct this real polarity-based news journal dominated media that's really starting to tear apart the fabric of real conversations. And it's not black or white. Gray is where a lot of the interesting stuff happens. And so I honor you for doing good work. I honor you for holding that line and not really going for the popular message, which would probably get you more clicks, but just being a reasonable, sensible researcher. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Pleasure.
Thank you. Let me know what you think. I'm sure there's going to be lots of comments here just in the chat thread there. I will see you later this week for another Facebook Live. We're banking up a few shows that'll then release on well.org and the Urban Monk and over the holidays. So we're working a little hard so we can hibernate in December. Let me know what you think. I'll see you next time.